We are diving into our fifth week of our Head to the Heart series, where we are looking at wisdom literature in the Old Testament and talking about how we're moving it from the head to the heart. So in the Hebrew language, and all of these books that we're studying, written in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, there is no distinction between our head and our heart. They're the same thing. And so what often happens is when we're thinking about wisdom, we think about it as head knowledge. And it's never designed to be that way. It's supposed to be something that we know on an intimate level, so much so that it completely changes how we live. We don't just know it up here. We know it in our whole being, and it changes who we are. So we have really talked about some hard things. We talked about the fear of God. We talked about suffering with others. We talked about what do we do with money. We talked about sex last week. And so I thought we need to take a little break to do a little lighter of a topic. And so this morning we're going to look at Ecclesiastes and talk about fairness and the meaning of life. Okay, so should be easy, simple. No, but seriously, Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books. It's just full of incredible wisdom. And I think the reason that it's so meaningful to me, the reason I love it so much, is that it's real. I mean, it's raw, it's real. It says some things that maybe I would like to say based on what I have seen in the world and how it works. And so I feel like I can identify with it, and I hope that you can too. Would you pray with me, and then we'll get started. Father, I ask that right now you would just remove all of the distractions out of this room, that you would focus our hearts completely on you. And that as we dive into this text this morning, that you would just open up our eyes, that we would see the things that you want us to see, hear and feel the things that you want us to hear and feel. And that we would walk out of this room changed and altered in the way that we live. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. As a kid, one of my most common refrains to my parents was, "That's not fair. That's not fair." So if my brother got to do something that I didn't get to do, I'd say, "Well, that's not fair." If he got a turn at something that I didn't get a turn at, I said, "That's not fair." If my sister got some kind of gift or something, or was allowed to do something and I didn't get to, I said, "That's not fair." My kids have started doing the same thing. So a couple weeks ago, Colby, my youngest daughter, told us that it wasn't fair that our older daughter got dessert and she didn't. That's not fair. It got finished off before. That's not fair. A few nights ago, I was putting Carrington to bed, and she looked at me and she said, "Why do you get to stay up?" That's not fair. Why do adults get to stay up later than kids? That's not fair. Just yesterday morning in our kitchen, I don't even remember the context, I wish I would, but our youngest daughter, again, repeated that phrase to me, "That's not fair." So this is something that, kids do, and I had several adults walking out of the first service be like, "My kids do that all the time," or "Here's how I solved that with my kids," and just funny stories. And I realized I do this as an adult, too. The story that I'm going to tell happened last year. I was sitting at home on a Sunday afternoon doing what I love to do on Sunday afternoons, watching the Bengals. And I'm sitting there watching it. The Bengals are down 7 with 11 seconds left. So the game is essentially over, except they have forced the Ravens to have to punt. And for those of you that don't know what that means that the Bengals are going to get the ball back with 3 or 4 seconds left. So the game is probably over. The Bengals are probably going to lose, but there's a chance. There's hope that something crazy could happen and the Bengals could actually force this thing to go into overtime. Crazier things have happened. Okay, so I'm sitting there on my couch. The Ravens are about to punt, and I'm watching this thing unfold. I want to show you this play. I want to show you what happens. All right, check this out. This guy back here is supposed to be kicking the ball. He doesn't have to kick it as long as he doesn't get tackled but the clock is running down. See, 4, 3, 2. You see that yellow thing in the corner? It says flag. That means that there was a penalty on the play. Okay? You see Baltimore 19, Cincinnati 12. Bengals are losing by 7. The clock says 0, so that means the game's over, but there's a flag on the play. All right. Now we're going to watch it again, and I'm going to show you why there was a flag, why there was a penalty on the field, okay? All right, here we go. Ravens are about to punt. Here we go. See this down here in that corner? That's a hold. Right up there, that's a hold. Do you see that? That's a hold. That's a hold. That's a hold right there. Okay, so I'm yelling at the TV in my living room, and I'm standing up, and there's no time on the clock, and nobody knows what's happening. Complete pandemonium breaks out after this. The referees, the officials actually get together, and they huddle for several minutes because none of them actually know what to do. And do you know what happens at the end? Nothing. Game over. The Ravens committed essentially 12 penalties on the play, and there was no punishment. And so I'm standing there in my living room looking at the TV, channeling my inner Will Duke, that's my dad, saying, "That's not fair!" And Lindsay's like, "Calm yourself down. You're scaring the children. It's just a game." But here's the thing about games. When we watch games, when we play games, we want there to be rules. And we want things to happen according to the rules. And if people break the rules, we want them to be held accountable. If somebody cheats while they're playing Monopoly with you, that's not okay. If someone commits a crime, we want them to be punished for that crime. If there's a politician who does something shady, we want them to be removed from office and held accountable. We like to know that there are rules that govern the world in which we live, and we want to know that everybody is going to be held accountable for those rules. Where does that come from? Where does that deep desire that we have for the rules to be followed, justice, in a sense, to be carried out, where does that come from? Are there actually a set of rules that define how the world works? And if so, where can we find them? Can you find them on the internet? Can you print them off? Where do you get these rules that govern the way that our world works? And who determines what they are? Who determines what's fair? Is your life fair compared to my life? Have the things that I have experienced in my life, are they fair compared to the things that you've experienced in your life? Are the things that we collectively experience as a people group in this culture, in this country in 2017, are they fair compared to people who live in other countries and don't have all the same things that we have and maybe have gone through tremendous difficulties that we've never gone through? Is that fair? What about people that lived 1,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago? Were their lives fair? I mean, how do we tell? Why are some people born into a royal family and they never have want of anything? They have limited resources or unlimited resources. And then other people are born into poverty and they don't have anything. Why are some people born into families full of individuals, moms and dads and grandparents that love them and teach them about what it means to love God, what it means to live like God, what it means to be a good citizen, and other people are born into these terrible situations where they have nobody in their life that they can look up to show them how to live? Is that fair? In youth ministry, sat with multiple families who have, I spent a lot of time in youth ministry, Lindsay and I, we have sat with multiple families who have lost teenage sons and daughters to tragic accidents. And I personally had a great-great-grandfather who was an abusive alcoholic who lived to be 104 years old. Is that fair? See, who determines what is fair? The fairness and the rules that govern how the world works, they kind of pull apart if you start asking questions like that, because you're like, I don't know. Those are real complicated questions. I'm afraid that fairness is more complicated than it sometimes seems like it should be. what should be often isn't, and what is often shouldn't be. As we look around the world, we say, that's not fair. We all kind of feel this, and that's not a new sentiment. In fact, you might say that there's nothing new under the sun. That's what the writer of Ecclesiastes would say. There's nothing new under the sun. In fact, he would use the phrase under the sun 30 times in 12 chapters. 30 times he's using this phrase, under the sun. And he's making a clear contrast. My argument is he's making a clear contrast with under the sun and above the sun, although he never explicitly says it. That's kind of the way that we're going to journey this morning. And here's how I will kind of summarize what we're going to talk about. His claim is that there is an absolute right, an absolute rightness above the sun. But things are not right under the sun. And while those under the sun have a universal longing for things to be right, God remains as the essence of rightness above the sun. Therefore, the only way that you can really understand life, the only way that you can understand this question and how to answer it is in light of God's larger story. I want to introduce you to somebody. His name is Q, or Koheleth. He's the guy that wrote this book that we're going to dive into. Pretty interesting fellow. We don't know all that much about him because his name isn't a name, it's a title. So Koheleth means teacher and kind of has the connotation of assembly. So kind of like right now, I would be the Koheleth in this room because I'm teaching and I'm communicating to an assembly. So these are the words of the teacher. Whenever it says the teacher, it's that Hebrew word, Koheleth, and we'll just call him Q today. Q was a wise man. We know this from the text. He was an old man. We know this from the text. He was a royal man, born into royalty, son of a king, and perhaps one of the statements suggests that he actually was a king. Based on everything that he's written here, he was certainly thoughtful and intellectual. And he was a descendant of David. So some people think that it was Solomon, some people don't. Doesn't matter, I don't think. So we might see this as the king's parting words to an assembly. This is some kind of a royal person who's communicating to the next generation some wisdom. Maybe even to his son, who's assuming the throne after him. Here's how he begins. The words of the teacher, Koheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says Koheleth. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is never full. To the place where the streams flow, there they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, more than one could express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. I, the teacher, Koheleth, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and a chasing after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. And that's pretty much where we're going to end today. Thank you for coming. Have a great week. A depressing week. I mean, this is like really heavy stuff, isn't it? Right out of the gate, he starts using a phrase that is going to be reiterated throughout, and it's usually translated something like everything is vanity and chasing after the wind. He uses that phrase or some combination of phrases that are like that 38 times in 12 chapters. So this is important. Just like under the sun is an important thing that he wants to grab onto, repetition is very important in writing. So under the sun is really important. So is this phrase, everything is vanity, chasing after the wind. But the problem with this phrase is that the Hebrew phrase is kind of hard to translate. It's centers on a word, habel, which is translated vanity here, but it's a complicated word to translate, and it's translated several different ways, futile, meaningless, but I actually don't like any of those translations, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But before I do that, this is maybe a little rabbit trail, but it's maybe important because I have to convince you that the way that I'm reading it is valid. So we have to take the rabbit trail, essentially. Here's what happens in the world of translation. You have a text, right? Really just manuscripts from texts and small pieces. You're taking that and you're translating it into a new language, right? That's what's happening. You have a group of people working on this. And when there's a word that's difficult to understand or difficult to translate, you have to make interpretive decisions on it. Okay, so as you read through the Bible, you're reading the interpretation. That translation requires interpretation. Okay, what happens when you run across a word that could mean a lot of different things and you're not really sure which direction to take it? Well, if you are a translator, it's best if you stay with the traditional understanding. They're wired that way anyway. People that get into translating work are usually pretty careful people. I mean, that's just by nature the kind of people that they are. So in this case, what you have is the King James Version, written back in the 1600s, used the word vanity. It's a difficult word to translate. And so what some of the more literal versions, like the New American Standard and the NRSV do, is they take that word from the King James and they just use it. It's not lazy. They might say that it's responsible because they're trying to not diverge too much from the traditional understanding of the word. But they'll use footnotes and study notes, and then they'll allow commentators, people who spend their whole life just diving into texts to understand words. They'll let them do the challenging work. Okay? In this case, I think this word needs challenge. The traditional translation of this word needs challenge. For one, what in the heck does vanity even mean? Have you used that word in the past month? Has anybody been like, you know what that is? That's vanity. None of you have, right? Unless you're talking about a dresser. If you're like, what's that? Oh, that's a vanity. That's the only way you've used that word lately. Nobody uses that word. Sometimes we use the word vain, but not very often, right? This is Old English vanity, and so it requires that we take a new look at this. And so I've kind of focused a lot of this on doing a deep dive on this word. And here's kind of what I came up with, that there's two words in English that probably capture this most effectively in a way that it makes sense in the text. So the first word is absurd, and the second is fleeting. Like a lot of Hebrew words, one English word can't capture it. Shalom, you can't take one English word and make it mean everything that shalom does. Peace and shalom, not the same thing. Peace is a weak word trying to translate shalom. Same way here. Okay, so we're going to take two English words. We're going to take fleeting and absurd together to have a meaning of this word. So absurdity is something that's inconsistent with logic or reason or common sense. You say, like, that's absurd. What you're saying is that it's inconsistent with reason. It doesn't make sense. But just because something is absurd doesn't mean that it's not true. Something can be absurd and still be true. There's a whole world of philosophy around absurdity. You should go Google it when you get home. It's fun. Absurdity is the ability to hold two things in your hands that seem to contradict each other and find meaning in neither one but find meaning instead in the tension between them. You guys are confused. That's okay. Let's take this, wisdom and folly. This is an example that the writer of Ecclesiastes uses. He says, you have wisdom in one hand, you hold folly in the other hand. You can't find meaning in wisdom or folly. You find meaning in the tension between being a wise person or a foolish person. The answer lies in the tension between the two. Okay, let's take wealth and poverty. He says, you can't find meaning in being a rich person, and you can't find meaning in being a poor person. What you can find is meaning in the tension between wealth and poverty. So, absurd in the sense that it doesn't make logical sense. You can't say rich people are always happy and poor people are always sad. You also can't invert it. I'm getting too old to do this. Gosh. You can't say poor people are always happy and rich people are always sad. You can find evidence that backs up all four of those statements, can't you? But you can't say black and white, rich people are always happy, poor people are always sad. Wealth equals happiness. Poverty equals sadness. Can't do it. It's absurd. It is inconsistent with common sense. Do you know why? Because in the ancient world, that's what they believed. That if you were rich, you must have been favored by God, and you were successful and happy. And if you were poor, then you were not favored by God. You were unsuccessful, and you weren't happy. And the writer of Ecclesiastes blows that up. Says, nope, that's not true. Life is absurd. I've seen it all. I'm sitting here reflecting on all my years of life, and I'm telling you, you can't make black and white distinctions like that. It's absurd. Life is absurd. Second thing that he says is that it is fleeting, which means that it's passing swiftly, vanishing quickly. Life and its components do not go on forever and ever. This one's easy for us to understand. We get it, right? Life is fleeting. Things that we hold in our hands now, they're finite, they're temporary, they're transient, they do not last forever. We hold wealth and poverty in our hands, essentially is what he's saying. And then while we're holding them, trying to find the meaning in between both of them, we look at both of our hands and they're both gone. They've slipped away. So, I think a great translation of this Hebrew word is fleeting absurdity. Life is fleeting absurdity. Doesn't make sense, and it's slipping through our hands. I'm going to read some things that he applies this to. He said, I apply myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly, but I learned that this too is chasing after the wind. Trying to be wise, trying to be mad, or trying to be, that's crazy, not like angry, crazy, or trying to be a fool. I couldn't find meaning in any of it. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. I took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was futile. That's that word, the word translating. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. I hated all my work that I labored at under the sun because I must leave it to the man who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Now imagine that this is a king giving it to an assembly and his predecessor, his son, sitting right there. He's like, I built all this and I've got to get it to this guy. And I don't know if he's a wise or a fool. You know, it's a dad maybe saying this to his son. I always picture Tommy Boy. You guys remember that movie? His dad's built this big business, and then he's got to transfer it over to his son, Tommy, who's not suitable for this. And he's like, I worked for this, and I've got to hand it over to this guy, is essentially what he's saying. He will take over all my work that I labored at skillfully under the sun. This too is, that's that word again that we're translating, futile. So I began to give myself over to despair concerning all my work that I had labored at under the sun. Where there is a man whose work was done with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and he must give his proportion to a man who has not worked for it, this too is futile and a great wrong. I've heard my dad express this sentiment a few times. Again, I observed all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them. They have no one to comfort them. So I admired the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive, but better than either of them is the one who never existed, who has not seen the evil of this world. So he says, like, things are so bad for some people, it's like better off if they hadn't even been born. In my futile life, I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in spite of his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who lives long in spite of his evil. And then again, I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, battle's not to the strong, bread does not go to the wise, the riches don't go to the discerning, the favor doesn't go to the skillful. Rather, time and chance happen upon all of them. For man certainly does not know his time. Like fish caught in a cruel net or like birds caught in a trap, so people are trapped in an evil time as it suddenly falls on them. You might read Ecclesiastes and say, this guy's in a depressing place. You also might read it and say, well, this guy's in a realistic place. There's a few things he's undercutting. I actually don't have time to get into all of them. I'm going to skip a few, but the one that I do want to reinforce, we talked about a few weeks ago when we did Job, was he is undercutting retribution theology again, which is the idea that good people get good things out of life, bad people get bad things out of life. Very common ancient belief. He's undercutting that and saying that's actually not one of those rules that guide how things work here. It doesn't work that way. I don't know if anybody has ever seen the show Madam Secretary. It's a show that I really like because it explores what is just and fair. So the Secretary of State is a woman, and she has a team, and they're working on issues that come about. And they have to figure out how to solve them. And each episode is enclosed, which means it always resolves at the end of every episode. So they're working hard to try to uncover these problems. So they have a problem, for instance, that affects the United States, it affects Uganda, it affects China, and it affects Poland or something like that. And they have to figure out, how do we go about making the right decision? Because it's going to affect all of these other countries. And the interesting thing is that they're the ones who have all the information, generally. And so they have to make these decisions based on all the information that they have. But all the other people who are involved in the problem don't have all the information. And so the decisions that they make often aren't popular. People don't understand, why did you make that decision? They don't have all the information. They see the bigger picture of this. And so the thing that I love about the show is that they present the main character, the Secretary of State, and her husband as these people who are full of integrity. And they always try to do the thing that they think is right and just. So there's this scene in Madam Secretary where her daughter, who's going through this real rebellious phase, she's become disenchanted with the political system and all of this. And she has really made things black and white. Things are this way, things aren't that way. And the Secretary of State character says this, and I loved it so much that I found it. I think I wrote it down, actually. It's such a good quote. She says, "If you never listen to anything I say again for the rest of my life, please hear this. Everything is more complicated than you think it is right now. The only way you come to know that is through experience." And that's the process. That's what the process of growing up is all about. Then her teenage daughter responds, "Yeah, I know. I got to go do that now." Some of you are like, I lived that. Here's the thing. They're solving all these complex problems with all kinds of factors. Does that mean that they shouldn't solve the problems? Does that mean that they should discard them because they're not meaningful? I would say precisely the opposite. I would say that they're dealing with very, very substantial, meaningful things. In the same way, what Q is dealing with here in the text, just because it's complicated and just because it's hard to make sense of it does not mean that it's meaningless or worthless. And that's why I take a lot of issue with the NIV translation of the word meaningless. I think it's a terrible translation of the word. It actually is the opposite meaning of the word, I think. He's not saying everything is meaningless. The writer of Ecclesiastes, if you read through it, he's eventually going to say everything is full of meaning. Everything's not meaningless. Everything is full of meaning, but you have to dive deep for it. You have to excavate it out. It's not there for our taking right there on the surface. It's not as simple maybe as we would like it to be. And he builds this structure that eventually communicates this with 4 pillars. Don't have a lot of time to dive into each one of these, so I'm just going to talk about each one real quickly. The first one is that, and I already mentioned these at the front of the teaching, but there's an absolute right above the sun. There is an absolute right above the sun. He never loses sight of this, even if it seems like he's really disenchanted, even if it seems like he's pretty depressed. He never loses sight that there is an absolute right. There's something that's right. His whole construction is built on the foundation that there is an external guiding absolute right. But that's not something that people in our time and place tend to believe. So the Barna group has done a lot of studies about this. And here's an example. The Barna studies show that 80% of American adults are concerned with the state of morality in our country. 80%. That's 8 out of 10. They think that things are messed up. 2/3 of American adults think that the solution is cultural consensus. If we can all just agree what's right as a culture, then we wouldn't have this feeling that things aren't the way they're supposed to be. Americans believe on a 3-to-1 margin, 3-to-1, and this is the way that the question is worded, that truth is always relative to circumstances. Americans believe on a 3-to-1 margin that truth is always, every time, relative to the circumstances. I used to give terrible advice to students in youth ministry, just as a general rule, but this is one of the examples. Terrible advice. I told them many times that the first time a college professor stands up and tells them that there's no absolute truth, that they should stand up, pick up their chair, and throw it at him or her and see what happens. And see how absolute that is. And then demand that they give an answer. They have to provide some kind of answer for why it was the wrong thing to do. Terrible advice. And it actually doesn't work anymore. Do you know why? Because a lot of thought leaders, and I'll include Richard Dawkins as a thought leader because I think he has shaped some of this, have finally, I know that Richard Dawkins, because I heard him say it, have finally conceded. They've stopped arguing, and they've just gone to the point where they've said things like murder and rape. They are not wrong. They are just counter to cultural norms. And if they were culturally normative things, then they wouldn't be wrong. So it's a carrying through of this idea that there is not an absolute guiding right somewhere in the universe. But the writer of Ecclesiastes, Q, he disagrees. There is an absolute right above the sun. He believes that. It's one of his 4 pillars of his argument. Second pillar is that things are not right under the sun. I don't even have to go into detail about this one. You guys know that. Watch the news. Evaluate the things that have happened in your life that were not right. And then you know things are not right under the sun. Things are not as they should be. So there is an absolute right above the sun. Things are not right under the sun. The third pillar, there's a universal longing for things to be right under the sun. We all long for it. We all want there to be right. We all long for justice. Dr. Peter May said, beauty is a pointer to ultimate meaning. It points us to the intention of the Creator and stirs up in us a yearning for transcendence. This niggles away at man's soul, a hunger for some integrating reality and ultimate fulfillment. We know that there is more to this life than meets the eye. Something's missing, something outside and beyond ourselves that would make sense of ourselves, a hunger even for God himself, which man in his own cannot work out. He knows in his heart of hearts that there must be a permanence in contrast to our transience, a wisdom that makes sense of our foolishness, a moral purity that is implied by our wickedness, but man hasn't the resources within himself to fathom it out. There is a universal longing that gets tapped into through a lot of things, through art, through sentiment, and so on, that reminds us that we are longing for things to be right. And then the fourth pillar of his argument is that God is righteous above the sun. God, Yahweh, is the right that is above the sun. He concludes his book with these words, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. There is an absolute right above the sun. Things are not right under the sun. There's a universal longing for things to be right under the sun, and God is righteous above the sun. That even when everything seems like it's falling apart, even when things are they're broken, they're fractured, it feels like it doesn't make sense, that we are living lives filled with fleeting absurdities, God still remains. He still remains right, righteous above the sun. We focus a lot around here, like I've mentioned in the when we were talking about giving back to God, focus a lot on God's story and having God's story be the thing that primarily shapes us over all the other stories that are out there that want to shape us. That God's story from beginning to end actually gives us context for who we are, for why we're here, for what this whole thing is about, what we're supposed to be doing, how to treat others, how to live as family. I mean, all of these things, right? This story that is supposed to be shaping us, that really should shape how we do everything, has a central character. And that central character is Yahweh, God himself. And life is only meaningful when understood in light that everything that we're doing, this life that we're all living, is in his story. He's the author, he's the architect, he's the protagonist. It's his story. We're going to sing a song together. It's a variation of an old hymn called It Is Well. And this song was, I'll just tell you about the hymn version and why it was written. Because it kind of speaks to this a little bit. Horatio Spafford was a businessman from Chicago. He lost his business in the Great Chicago Fire, but that wasn't the worst thing that happened to him. A few years after that, his wife and 4 daughters were traveling to Europe, and their ocean liner collided with another ship, and it sank within 12 minutes. His wife Anna, she made it out alive, but the 4 daughters did not. He immediately, as soon as he could, got on a boat to travel across ocean to France to be with her. And as they were approaching the place in the ocean where that boat sank, he was informed of that, and he began to write, and he wrote the words to It Is Well. See, Horatio and his wife Anna had something to cling to beyond what Hugh had to cling to, which is this, that there is in fact something new under the sun. It's Jesus. Jesus is new under the sun. God wrapped up in a human body, coming to bring the rightness above the sun to those who live in the wrongness under the sun. So when our lives are filled with fleeting absurdities, we can say, we know that Jesus is setting all things right, making all things new, and it is well.